Thanks for coming. My name's Ted Gordon. I'm the author of this book. Next to me are Marcia Bassett, Luke Stewart, Keith Fortin-Whitman. So tonight I kind of imagined this event as a kind of a hybrid book talk, panel talk, and then also performance. So the format's going to be, we're going to talk for half an hour or so about some stuff from the book. I have a lot of questions for these musicians who I respect incredibly and really admire. And I want to leave at least 15 minutes for questions and comments from the house, from the audience. There's a microphone there in the middle, academic conference style, so you can, you can feel free to ask whatever questions you want. I thought I would just begin by talking a bit about this book, how it came about, what it is about, and what it isn't about. It has a really, it has this cover with a booklet box on it. And I guess the booklet was my first way into thinking about this kind of instrument. I was a graduate student, it was 10 years ago. I was like floundering, thinking about writing about experimental music and electronic music. And I came across this amazing book of like primary sources and interviews about the San Francisco Tape Music Center. I see some people like nodding their heads in the house. I had heard that this thing was a big deal. I knew that certain composers, came up there and founded it. I knew this guy Morton Subotnick was one of the founders. I knew Pauline Oliveros worked there. I had heard like Steve Reich and Terry Riley were involved. And as a very, doe-eyed, idealistic graduate student, I was like, that's what I want to do research on. So I went to the Bay Area and I started talking to people, and I quickly realized that this center was incredibly messy, and it wasn't the case that it was just like the Columbia-Princeton Electronic Music Center on the East Coast, where like amazing work had happened and then it had been forgotten because it wasn't in New York. But something really different was happening there, mostly to do with psychedelic drugs, which had been, thank you, thanks, yeah. You can, I want this to be as raucous as possible, so if you want to, applaud anything I talk about, go ahead. It was psychedelic drugs, it was also the kind of military-industrial academic complex and the vestiges and refuse of, some cheers for that, okay. All this like stuff that was just in the Bay Area, like telecom stuff, military stuff, electronics. And finally, when I got my hands on one of these instruments, it was like the peak of the so-called analog revival, maybe one of the earlier peaks. This new company had come out called Buchla Electronic Musical Instruments. They were selling Buchla systems, these little music easels. And I was like, great, I'm just going to spend my entire grad school stipend check on one of these things. So I did that, which was dumb of me, but very financially irresponsible. But as soon as I got this instrument, all these like amazing promises that I had been fantasizing about in my head, like it's going to allow me to like express myself in ways I've never expressed myself before. It's going to be so cool, and I'm going to make the weirdest, coolest music. It did not happen. And I was incredibly frustrated. And it wasn't the instrument's fault, and it wasn't like I was a bad musician. What I came to realize over the course of working with this instrument and other instruments like it was that something very different was going on, like a very different kind of human-instrument interaction was happening. And it wasn't really an instrument that I could improvise on like an acoustic instrument, like my viola, which I had been performing on for my whole life. And it wasn't like Max MSP, which I had been using. It wasn't like I could program it and it would do what I wanted it to do. It was something weirdly in between. So that was like one kernel of what I wanted to write a book about, was an instrument that was an informational instrument. It wasn't like a musical instrument. It was somehow related to a computer, but not really a computer. And it just occupied this like very liminal space. And I knew that although Morton Subotnick is a truly masterful musician and composer and innovator, I knew that I felt a kind of a disconnect between the kinds of rhetoric that he brought to this instrument, his buchla, system, and my own experience with it. And it wasn't until I encountered, let me pull up an image here really quick, sorry. I encountered, I encountered these recordings of Sun Ra performing in Europe in 1970. And you can see on the right-hand side of this photograph, he's playing this weird instrument. It's on top of a farfisa organ, and in the foreground there's another electric keyboard, instrument there. It's a prototype mini Moog. And what I had kind of learned through marketing discourse and journalistic discourse was that the mini Moog was kind of the opposite of the buchla. It was a keyboard instrument. It sounded nice. I mean, no disrespect to buchla players. It was reliable. You could make a really fat bass line with it, and I had, of course, listened to Bernie Worrell and so many other mini Moog players. But when I heard Sun Ra play the mini Moog, my mind was blown for a number of reasons. I mean, firstly, just because to hear Sun Ra play an instrument is, an ecstatic experience, but also because the sounds he made with this instrument were nothing like the sounds of any other mini Moog or any other Sun Ra performance I'd ever heard. And he was really playing this instrument in a strange way, and he was not playing his compositions. He would only play it solo. He would not play it with the ensemble, with the orchestra. And then I read his interviews, or rather listened to his interviews at this time, and the ideas that he was bringing towards his instruments were the exact opposite of Subotnick's. So Subotnick is I want a composer's black box that will let me paint music. It'll be like an easel. It'll allow me to express myself immediately and gesturally, and it'll be freeing. It'll emancipate me. And you'll hear my it's like a shortcut between my inner self, my brain, which is electrical or electronic, and electronic sound. And what Sun Ra says about his instruments are, my instruments and my music has nothing to do with freedom. It's not about freeing the individual person at all. In fact, freedom is a myth, and not in a good way. Freedom is kind of a lie, actually. And I'm all about discipline and precision, and when I play my music, you're not hearing me, you're hearing infinity. You're hearing something that is immeasurable, something you can't count, something that you can't understand, and yet kind of makes sense in this kind of cosmic mathematics, this alter world, kind of alter science or tone science that he developed. So that was the kernel of this book, thinking about cybernetics and information theory in the development of electronic musical instruments in the 60s, and starting with these two poles. One pole says these instruments allow you to completely short circuit and black box this complex process of making electronic music and express yourself more fully. You can make any sound you imagine. And the other pole says the sounds you make with these boxes are fundamentally and profoundly opaque and illegible. And that doesn't mean that they're bad or not valuable, but that is the point of using electronics. Because, the human subject or the human subject as expressed by electronics is something that's other than, something that's not knowable, something that you don't own yourself, something that has to do with the social and the political, and that's kind of where I started this book. That was the genesis of it. And in between those poles, there's chapters in the book about Pauline Oliveros and her early electronic music with oscillators, making what her friend Stuart Dempster called garbage, improvising, finding weird sounds that she didn't know how she was making and yet were interesting and seemed to be emerging from the system itself. And then Alvin Lucier, who is often cited as a composer who is interested in the nature of sound itself and letting sounds speak for themselves, but in investigating his archive, which is held at the New York Public Library for the Performing Arts, which I would recommend everybody in this room as New Yorkers, please go there and look at the Lucia archive and the Pauline Oliveros papers too. Amazing archives. Basically all of his early sketches and scores and preparatory materials for all these famous works like Music for Solo Performer, Vespers, etc., are not about sound at all, but rather are about signification. They're about symbols. They're about writing. They're about inscription. They're about poetics. I didn't include this quote in the book, but I reread his 1980 book of interviews with Charles Simon, which is called Chambers, recently. And towards the end of the book, he said, I'm interested in the poetry of what we used to call science. And I think that really nicely encapsulates my kind of take on Lucier's work. So yeah, the book is like these 5 case studies, Subotnik, Buchla, and then Oliveros, Lucier, Sun Ra. And a forward introduction and afterward that attempt to kind of bring it all together and think about what it feels like to play a musical instrument that in some way also can play itself and that doesn't respond physically to the energy that you put into it kinetically, but rather responds to information that you put into it, through touch or through other kinds of control. Does that make sense? I don't know. I should have probably thought more about preparing that spiel, but I didn't. Does anyone have questions for me about anything I just said? Please don't be shy. Hans is laughing. Yeah, I know it's a ridiculous question to ask. I don't know, maybe I can open it up to my collaborators here on the stage. It feels weird for me to ask this question of y'all, but was there anything in the book that kind of really jumped out at you or like struck you as unusual or like novel or maybe you didn't agree with?
Yeah, I mean, I remember early on there's a Subotnik quote where he says, tape music doesn't have a Beethoven. And I think about that a lot. I was thinking about that the whole time I was reading the book because it's right at the top,
Uh-huh.
Tape music totally has a Beethoven. There's so many, like, virtuosic, Anyway, as an aside, not to
Yeah.
Okay. Otherwise, 100%.
I mean, there's something, I think the quote is like, there's no Beethoven of the tapes.
Yeah, something like that, yeah. But it's the sentiment.
There was a very powerful idea that these instruments would allow a musician to kind of like leave this baggage of the 19th century behind. And Lucier writes about that too, like in his diaries and stuff from this period. But that's like, that's differential based on the kind of like social position of the musician there, right? Like Subotnik and Lucier have something to leave behind because they've been enculturated into this world of classical music and being a composer, in that social world, that social milieu. They went to conservatories. Lucier studied in Europe. He did the classic. He went to Yale, and then he was from this prominent, family, and went to this conservatory, same conservatory that Ramon Sender, Subotnik's colleague at the Tate Music Center, went to. But for Oliveros and Ra, and for Don Buchla, I don't think that they felt like they had to get away from something. They had more to kind of gain and explore in a novel kind of way.
Yeah. Firstly, thank you for having us. And the one thing that thank you also for having Sun Ra as such a singular figure in the book as well, because a lot of the attention and platforms and in the whole world of electronic music, very curiously leaves out Sun Ra so much as an innovator and really one of the first users of of the medium and of the instrument, and certainly one of the pioneers of music in general, and just his place as an electronic musician pioneer within the context of the music that he was making. You know, whether that be adjacent to jazz or, you know, otherwise, because there's a lot of things going on in his career at that time as well. His space in New York, and then his move to Philadelphia and things. But always part of the continuum of his career and, you know, his message of what he was trying to put out through the music. And
Yeah.
It makes total sense that he would be, you know, celebrated alongside, you know, in the canon more so. But it's good to see that this is happening more now.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to overstate how rare and expensive these instruments were in the 60s and how unavailable they were. Even as the Moog synthesizer was everywhere in terms of recordings, like after the explosive meteoric hit of Switched On Bach in 1968, everybody, you know, in North America and England and Europe had heard the sounds of the Moog. No one knew what it was or what it did or how it worked or whatever. One of the opening vignettes I use in the book is none other than Leonard Bernstein at a young people's concert in 1969, wheeling out a Moog system on stage with all its blinking lights and stuff, and saying, you know, this is a Moog, it can do anything but stand up and take a bow. We're gonna hear it play Bach. And then very subtly, there's a tape machine on top of it, and he hits play on the tape machine. The Moog is just there for show. Like the sequencer's going, the lights are blinking, some patch cables are patched in. It's not doing anything, because a Moog can't do that, right? It's a monophonic, like, synthesizer. It would take like hours to tune it. You can't do polyphonic music on it, all this stuff. So there was a real like hunger for these instruments at the same time as like they were prohibitively expensive and only accessible if you had institutional affiliations like Cybernetic did at Mills College. And you know, the first Buchla system was built with monies from the Rockefeller Foundation. You know, the people who, I mean, I don't want to list the kind of like horrors of what Rockefeller and Ford funded in terms of public health and, you know, global politics and anti-communist stuff in the mid-century. But, you know, this is Rockefeller Foundation money. And you had to either be independently wealthy, like Richard Alpert was, the LSD researcher, to buy one of these. He was one of the earliest commissioners, or have an institution like Columbia University, which also bought one early on and still has it up in their studio. So the issue of access is important. And including Ra is important, I think, also because he, despite not having like the capital of these other composers, was the first to acquire any commercially available electronic instrument as early as like the 1940s. I mean, John Swed somehow claims that he acquired a wire recorder in the 1930s, which I think is historically impossible. But you know, it stands that like he was on the south side of Chicago in Hyde Park with a wire recorder in like 1945, recording some of his earliest records. You know, he acquired a Solovox. He acquired all the Hammond instruments, and he played a Moog. He played Gershon Kingsley's Moog system. You guys know Popcorn, like the novelty song. That Gershon Kingsley. He played on that instrument in 1969. And was connected to Moog through this Nigerian writer and promoter, Tam Fiofori, in 1970. So, you know, like, if Ra had had those material connections, he probably would have been playing instruments like this much earlier, you know? But it wasn't until people at the Moog company were, like, trying to develop a consumer-friendly portable instrument that, that Ra got his hands on it. One other anecdote I'll say about that, Moog had been trying to get musicians to play his synthesizer for a long time. He took out advertisements in trade magazines saying, we have this studio in Trumansburg, come up and play it. nobody really took, right? Because composers had no idea what this thing was. And commercial musicians were like, this is a novelty thing. Paul, I don't know if this is true or not. I didn't put this in the book because it's not verifiable. Paul Bley, you guys know who Paul Bley is, claims in his biography that he... Oh, he's a white Canadian jazz pianist and composer in the kind of like free jazz experimental community, in the 1960s and 70s. He claims that he heard about the Moog and just called up Moog, and Moog was like, come on up to Trumansburg. He played a big Moog modular system. Moog gave him one. And that's like $20,000 in 1969, so probably, I don't know, $150,000 maybe in 2026 dollars. And so, Moog was kind of trying to place these expensive systems with musicians. When Sun Ra came up, Moog did not give him a Moog modular. He gave him this kind of broken prototype of the Mini Moog Model B. And that is significant because you can see this here. This is taken at the Festac 77 festival in Lagos, Nigeria. The Mini Moog is on the right of the image here. This instrument that Ra had was manufactured from like broken parts, stuff from the synthesizer graveyard. There's a whole like kind of zombie thread here that I didn't take up in the book, which I probably could have. But it has a status of alterity here. And also the knobs on the panel don't really correspond in a transparent way with like what it does. It makes really strange sounds. And if you listen to these recordings from the European tour and African tour, 1970, 71, you will hear this unmistakable, strange sound. That's saying a lot for Sun Ra. You'll hear a strange sound in a Sun Ra record, but even stranger than normal Sun Ra sounds, because this instrument could not produce harmonic sound. It could only produce inharmonic sound, basically. And it was noisy, and the filters were all messed up, and Sun Ra loved that. I mean, he was like, I have a one-of-a-kind instrument, and it does what I do. It demonstrates the discipline and precision of of infinity, of the universe. And people, you could listen to that and be like, what is he talking about? Like, this is all just empty rhetoric, right? Discipline and precision. But I think what he's getting at is there is some kind of higher order consciousness or agency that he's appealing to with this instrument, and he's kind of able to tap into that or channel it through this in a fundamentally opaque or black way. There's an opacity to the box. Yeah. I guess I'm curious to ask y'all about your own experiences with like some of these concepts from cybernetics and information theory, like feedback. I mean, it's a very commonplace concept that we talk about all the time. But I know that each of you in your own way have like thought about feedback and information and like automation maybe, or maybe not automation, but kind of giving up a certain amount of agency and letting something emerge from performance or in the moment of performance. I'm curious about like if you have thoughts about that, if you have thoughts that you could share about your own work.
You want me? Well, I guess what we were just talking about with Sun Ra, but also thinking in the sense of a place that doesn't have time, that there isn't an infinity. I think that when you're improvising, you can enter into a space that loses track of the current space that you're in and transcends the moment, and that's the magical time when you can get into that space, and it doesn't always happen. And like you were saying earlier, getting this synthesizer and thinking like, well, I'm gonna like make all these like cool, interesting sounds, and a lot of times I'm like, oh God, that's that's not the sound I want. I think it's being comfortable with lack of control for me personally, and then once I'm comfortable with that, then allowing myself to really just explore and let myself and the instrument move into this space that can, I mean, I don't know, we can have like many different like analogies for it, like it's a meditative state or it's like a transcendental state. It's, in a lot of ways, I don't really think there is a language to describe it because it is musical and it lacks the verbal description.
Yeah.
For me personally, I think sometimes when you're trying to describe it, then it deflates what it really is. And so you're assigning this meaning to something that is almost inexplicable. So
Yeah, I mean, what you're describing is what the historian of science, Andrew Pickering, talks about as a kind of a swerve away from the detour through knowledge. Like when he talks about cybernetic performance, he has this whole thing about ontological theater and kind of like this theatrical presentation of a performance that refuses to be represented, refuses to kind of like be knowable, and is just like ontologically a performance without being able to be counted or represented or even like maybe seen or heard in some sense. And that's like one kind of classic interpretation of cybernetics, right? Like a performance that, or a behavior that, you know, exceeds representation, exceeds symbolization, exceeds, you know, signification, and just kind of is its own thing, like outside of our world of language and figures and math and stuff. What I think is interesting is like, that's different for every musician though. Like I don't think that's kind of a universalizable experience. For some musicians, it requires a lot of mastery and on some level control. Like you said, like that can spin out of control and then you have to like, you know, stop it, right? Mm-hmm. For others, like conceptually, maybe that's okay. Like maybe getting out of control and like having it lose that meditative state and it being like totally wild and like weird. Is kind of like the objective. I know that Luke, like when you play bass and in your recordings, like I know the records you made, Works for Upright Bass and Amplifier, you entered those zones a lot of feedback, especially with like such a physical, in a very physical sense, not just like an informational sense. You're not like turning a knob on a synthesizer and being like, what does that sound like, right?
Or am I?
Or are you?
Definitely twisting a lot of knobs.
Yeah,
sure.
On your amp.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, obviously, hope that the thing that we're gonna experience all together tonight as well works for upright bass and amplifier. You know, utilizing feedback generated from the amplifier, the bass amplifier. And using the electroacoustic properties of the upright bass to generate the feedback, and then using my physicality of moving it back and forth to create dynamics, to create music into my ears. So yeah, that's one thing that that we'll all experience today, and I think it really, you know, in being deeply influenced, of course, by Sun Ra and all the people that are in the book. Really, the thing that they all share, and one of the things that makes them innovators, especially using the Sun Ra example of he's using this instrument that's all beat up, that's still a prototype, but is intended for a specific purpose. And I think this is one of the really key elements of any electronic musician, experimental or otherwise, is that they're using the electronic instrument in the way that's not intended. They're using a system that is basic and simple and has a specified use, but these people are using them in a different way. So that's why that is the key disciplined innovation, because that takes a level of experience with the instrument, but also takes a level of intent and reflective of a greater worldview that comes along with musicality as such. So being at the same time connected through the natural ways of acknowledging I suppose the natural element of electronic signals, of electricity, as being a fifth element, so to speak, and using that as a way to connect with yourself, with the cosmos,
Yeah.
with your electrical signals and what have you.
Could I ask you about discipline?
Yes.
Do you rehearse? That's a weird question. Do you rehearse this kind of performance? And when you do, what does that look like?
I have rehearsed, yes. Yeah. But I'll also push back and say that there's a lot of different kinds of rehearsal.
Sure.
This is a rehearsal as
Yeah.
well that we're going to be doing on stage, which is also the power of improvised music,
Yeah.
which a lot of electronic music is anyway, even though it's, again, it's intended to be quantized. It's intended to be a default. It's intended to have, in this, even in the sense of Moog, it's intended to be tempered,
Yeah.
to correspond to our notions of what music is.
Yeah.
Especially in the 60s, it's howdy doody time, so it's very basic music in the 60s by and large.
Yeah.
Which is why an album like, as revered and everything that we have for Switched on Bach, but that's why that happened, because it's very basic, it's very easy, and it was doing exactly what the instrument was intended to do, perhaps, to recreate something that already existed with this different kind of electronic sound.
Yeah.
For the purposes of selling that instrument for $26,000, or whatever.
Yeah. Well, I asked the question just because I'm curious about like a kind of an iterative process of like having to rehearse and have a disciplined sense of relationship with the instrument in order to kind of like get past that learning curve. Like Marcia, you're saying like you get the instrument, it's like you're trying to make a sound that you think you want it to make, and it's like it's not doing what I want. It's like something I don't like. And it takes a certain amount of discipline to like stick with it and like really understand what this dynamic is between the human and instrument, right? It's like it's not a thing that can behave very well, or like the way you want it to behave. And in every room, it's different. And with the Buchla, it's like the capacitive, not in this one, but in the Bemi easels, like the keyboard. Like sometimes I have to like take my shoes off to like ground myself, electrically, so the instrument would like do what I want. Or if it was like too humid, it would, be weird or something,
Well, I think also, sorry. I think also with the easel, I find that allowing that unknown to happen is part of playing that instrument rather than trying to have control over it,
Right.
which like you can, and a lot of artists use it in a way that they're like using MIDI with it, or they're using like a loop pedal, or they're really mixing with the synthesizer to create a very composed piece, and that's valid. It's just different people have different approaches, and so it's I've sort of accepted that like, okay, like let's just like let this go and explore it in the moment and do this real time composing, which for me works.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Yeah. Keith, can I ask you about I know that you have like several like frameworks for doing, I don't know how to call them, iterative instances of the same work. Like I'm thinking about the playthroughs.
Right, yeah.
Like how do you conceptualize that?
Yeah, I mean, it was a choice early on to kind of like put a methodology under our umbrella, like a working method. And it made it easier to people to understand that work was being continued in the same train of thought, while it might be changing vastly in sound or genre even,
Okay.
And that was it was like a kindness, I think, just to be like, this is all under this, this all stems from one way of thinking about sound and what could be done, especially in real time. Like all these things that I do these days are all real-time music, they're all composed, but they're happening, everything could be encapsulated in
What do you
the
mean by
moment.
composed?
Well, in that the system itself is the composition,
Okay.
the framework itself, right?
Yeah.
So that's like, Luke, when you set up your system, that's the piece, right? That's as much as you can attribute the authorship of something. Is
You hear that, composers?
yeah. No, we're on the same boat here.
I
Definitely.
want to hear it.
Yeah, maybe that's wresting control away from something, like just taking it into the more personal,
Do you find it, I know that you said that whenever you play works or perform frameworks, like playthroughs or the
Yeah.
generators, do you find that to be different from just doing a purely improvised set, or do you even conceptualize what you're doing as improvisation?
Yeah, I mean, if improvising means using the instrument, and the instrument itself is the framework, and the framework is the piece,
Yeah.
So it's like, you're playing a bass. It's the bass, right? Right, so.
But do you think that, do you think that your instrument, which we're all going to see on a very nice large screen in a little bit, does it behave the same way every time you interact with it?
Oh, God, no. No, I only have maybe 33% control over it at any given time.
33%.
Also,
Okay.
humidity and factors, just grounding and,
Yeah.
yeah. It's an electronic instrument, all of these things are, they're flighty, impossible to rein in entirely,
Right.
And there's so many mitigating factors with how you interact with them,
Yeah.
And I think a great thing might take away from a lot of this stuff is that in any sense of creation with these instruments is collaboration, right? You really are working within, I don't design any of the things that I use, I combine them in maybe novel ways, right?
Right.
The building blocks of electronic music, but
Right.
I'm not the one that sat there with the breadboard and made these things,
Right.
came up with the ideas. We have the, Buchlas and Surges and, people to hinge on, honestly. There's a rich lexicon of 70, 80 years at this point of,
Right.
designs that we can liberally borrow from and combine in whatever ways we see fit, and this kind of where I am now is I'm almost entirely, I started with computer music, I went to school to study, computer music at Berkeley. And synthesizers were we have the same theory. They were kind of economically not viable, whereas a computer at the time, definitely more so now, you can get so much more done, sonically and exploratorily on a computer, right? And these things were seen as boutique. They were, well out of the reach of anybody, the first time I got a synthesizer, I think I found, a Multivox or one of these cheap, preset synths. Yeah, it had a frog sound and a popcorn sound, it was one of these kind of things, right? And I was so whoa, a real thing, like an actual thing with keys and knobs, right? And I was very in the thick of exploring it, and I walked into my local record store, I was probably 12 or 13. And I was like, what are some synth records, And the guy, this is very prescient, he was like, yeah, here's Affenstunde, here's, whatever, electronic meditation. And then he was like, here's My Brother the Wind Volume 2, listen to the second side. And I was like, okay. And I got it home and I was like,
This is
what?
My Brother the Wind Volume 2 is the
it's
record that Alton Abraham released of
it's-
these demo tapes from the Trumansburg Moog factory
Yeah.
that I don't think were intended for public performance. They're really strange.
It's super,
recordings.
we can use every adjective in the book, but it's very particular and treats, the synth as this sculptural thing, it's just very, you've watched that clip of, Rob playing the organ where he's spinning around. It's he has a very cool, fluid way of interacting with all this stuff,
Yeah.
And the instruments are hinging on industrial design, right? But then you can also just completely circumvent that and just be physical with them, and that record is, probably the best example of that,
Yeah.
He did a lot of great stuff, after that, but that's the first real shock of, the new
Yeah,
Yeah,
awesome.
and I was so like, wow, you know, it's like someone can play you a switched on box sure, and you're like, this is technically impressive, and took months of laborious overdubbing and fine tuning.
Yeah.
And, you know, or even like Subotnick Sidewinder, I think about a lot
yeah,
with the striping
yeah.
the CV to tape and all that. It's
Uh-huh.
like it's so incredible on a technical
Yeah.
level. But then you sit with a record like that, you know, that particular Sun Ra, and you're like, wow, this is so just aesthetic and just
Right.
you know, coming from nowhere. I mean, really, there's no like lingua franca at that point. It was
Right.
just there's the thing. Maybe we heard this Wendy Carlos, whatever, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's this already like in year 2, there's this like complete denial of like the
Yeah,
you know
yeah, yeah.
rigidity of it, you know.
Yeah.
So obviously I chose that path and kept going on it. But
Cool. Thanks for that.
yeah,
I think we should open it up to Q&A. And I'm mindful of the time. So we have like maybe 5 or 10 minutes for questions from the audience. Do you have questions for any of our panelists? Or for me, there's a microphone right over here.
We have a question over here.
There's a question. Oh, yeah.
I think it might be a good segue.
Okay.
So, hi, great to really, hi, everybody. So I have been reading a lot of Willem Flusser's writings, philosopher, and I have been also teaching some of these writings, but in one of his books, which is called Gestures, there's the gesture of listening. And it's kind of, it makes me think of your book, Ted, because he has a chapter, and of course it's called The Gesture of Listening, that says composers, you know, in that way of 33%, the composers act cybernetically. They manipulate the input and output of the black box body. And I like that, right? Because then it extends beyond the maker or you and the instrument, right? Or you and the technology. So into the listening body, right? So my question is, in referencing this, how does the intimate relationship of the composer or maker with the technology medium extend to the process or the intention of listening, right? Like, do you have intentions for the listening body, or does the technology advocate a kind of reception? What are we, the variable of the audience here, as something to think about, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think like, sorry, what if you guys want to take this on? Okay. I think it's the question of audience and performance and who's listening or what's listening or how maybe like audition or sensation in general happens with this work is a really important question. Early on, Pauline Oliveros was doing these experiments with oscillators in the San Francisco Tape Music Center, and she would fill reel after reel with these oscillators, you know, intermodulating with each other and with the bias frequency printed on the tape, which is like 80,000 hertz. She could hear them. She could only hear some of that, of the signal on the tape. She couldn't hear all of it. She didn't know what these things were, who would want to listen to them, if they could be performed, if they were works, how they related to her own ability to hear. If there were sounds on the tape she couldn't hear, which there were, right, like the bias frequency. I think what a lot of these like electronic informational instruments and technologies do is reconfigure audition from a kind of a biological process to an informational process. Then they posit the existence of, you know, auditory information, or maybe we can call it sound, that is, you know, unhearable, intangible, ineffable. That's a very like seductive and powerful idea. But it also calls in, it brings up the question of like, you know, what are the limits of human hearing? And also like what kinds of pleasure and desire are triangulated by the performance of these kinds of performances where people are 33% in control, right? I mean, maybe this is just like me being a neurotic person, but I always, when I perform, wonder like, you know, this is doing something for me, like as Marcia was saying. I'm getting into this like zone. I'm letting go. I'm experiencing this opaque moment, right? This like black box moment. I don't know what it does for someone who's observing that. And I often worry that it's just, you know, it's like very solipsistic. I mean, like the horizon of where this can be revelatory or transcendental. Does it extend beyond the individual? I don't know. This also comes up, when Buchla like compares his instruments to psychedelic technologies. I mean, when you like are babysitting someone who's on acid, it's kind of like you're not having those revelations. You're just kind of observing it. You're observing someone else having an ecstatic experience. So I don't know. Yeah, I've never read Flusser. I know nothing about the gesture of listening, and now I'm so curious, and I'm so excited to read that. Yeah, thanks for that question. Other questions from the house? Yeah.
Question, I'll just shout it out.
Okay.
I'm interested just in the time frame of the book, and it seems to coincide with instruments in flux, right, from the earliest Buchla systems to this prototype of the mini-mode. And I was curious about how you arrived at the decision, just in terms of chronology, where to end the book.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. The question was about the time frame of the book. I really end the book in 1970, and that's well before most electronic music that most of us know and love was ever made. The reason I did that was because I wanted to examine a period in history when the concept of a synthesizer or an electronic musical instrument had not been concretized and was really still being negotiated very actively by instrument designers and musicians. By 1973, keyboard synthesizers, hit the shelves, and the ARP, Odyssey, and the Minimoog Model D, the two models after this Model B prototype, were selling, and they appeared everywhere in popular music. It's kind of crazy that in this, 6-7 year period, so many blueprints for how to do electronic musical instruments were developed. Not only Buchla and Moog, but there were so many others too. That I kind of I had this huge list in the book's introduction of I could have written this book about 10 other musicians or 10 other instruments, But really, keeping it to and ending it in 1970 was about ending it before these things had been concretized and became legible. Also, most of the musicians I read about, including Sun Ra, gave up these instruments by the mid-70s. So Sun Ra abandons, although when I first saw this picture actually of him with this Minimoog in 77, my mind was blown because I thought that he had given it up and only played the Model D, which is a much more reliable instrument. After 74, Space is the Place. You see him with 2 Model Ds in that movie. Subotnick got Buchla to design newer instruments. Alvin Lucier kind of gave up his earlier speculative works and started going really all in on compositions that were acoustic in nature. And Oliveros gave up electronic music basically entirely by 1970 in favor of sonic meditations. So there's this early period where everyone's kind of negotiating what these new technologies mean. And by 1970, there's a window in the 60s, and by 1970, that window kind of closes a little bit, whereas the aperture is narrower, maybe. Yeah, thanks. Maybe we have time for one more.
So I gotta say I appreciate the book. The chapters, particularly about Oliveros, was really insightful. The way that she's applying the listening, the deep listening, and improvisation cycles, and I feel like that really highlights the cybernetic loop that you're talking about. I think the question that I'm thinking about is she's pulling that technique from classical music training, as I understand it, where that's used in the service of these instruments that people have played for that have a much more developed history of use and that have much more developed technique. And then she's using it. It's so applicable. It's so remarkable how applicable it is to this new medium, the new instruments, where it's a process of discovery that's needed, that's so different. And so then she's applying this technique
Yeah, so I think there's two things I'm hearing in the question that I want to address briefly because I want to respect everybody's time here. The first is that her teacher, Robert Erickson, taught her to improvise while recording herself to tape, which was novel, in order to, what Erickson said, or what Erickson described as like discover her quote unquote natural, proclivities as a performer and as a composer. This was a novel way to conceptualize improvisation. And although it's extremely commonplace for I don't know if any of you had this experience, but as like a child taking violin lessons, my teacher would make me videotape myself and then watch the tape so I could look at how I was performing, my posture, my bow arm, see all these things I couldn't physically understand in the moment of performance, right? That turns you into a machine. I mean, it turns you into a cybernetic, object. It doesn't treat the human subject in a way that the human subject had been treated before that feedback loop was possible. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is a thing, and it's an important conceptual leap that I think is so commonplace today that it's unremarkable, right? What Oliveros. Yeah, I mean, she's stopped doing that but she started to use feedback in other kinds of ways that were not just about, observing an entire performance and then seeing what she liked about it. The feedback became shorter. It became real-time feedback instead of having to stop the tape, rewind it, and play back, right? And I think that really it's the real-time feedback element that becomes crucial for differentiating these kinds of instruments and the kind of performance we're thinking about from other kinds of conceptualizations of a human performer as mechanistic or a behavioral system or something. So yeah, real-time feedback I think was her major innovation, and we all, I think, to certain extents, are use that concept in our performance practices, which we will do after the intermission. So let's take a 10-15 minute break. When we get back, Marcia and I, Keith and Luke, will all perform short sets, 15-20 minute sets, and we're going to leave this microphone in the house, and we're going to dedicate 10 minutes of time per set for discussion, feedback, Q&A from the audience. So if you have questions about what we're doing, how we are thinking about our instruments or performing with each other, please think about those while we're performing, and then feel free to ask them after we perform. So thanks, everyone.
was curious if you guys could talk about your instrument choice. Like something like you're playing right now that is constrained versus something adjacent like a surge system, or the kind of like arms race of acquisition and design that is Eurorack. How does that play into how you've chosen what you've chosen to use and how that affects your practice?
Hello? Okay, yeah. Can people hear me? Okay. Yeah. Am I on? Yes. Hi. Yeah, so when I first got this easel, I had no idea what I was doing with it, and it is color coded so that really you could quite simply learn how to do that, but I didn't read any instructions, and I just started patching it together, and yeah, I think I had like a friend come over and say like, "That's crazy." You're even getting a sound out of that. And yeah, just slowly I started to learn from others. I had a friend that lived in New York City that had an easel, and he and I would get together and play, and I learned some basic simple patches from him. I also would say that he introduced me to Todd Barton, and Todd Barton is an amazing, generous person who has like posted a lot of videos on YouTube and has his own YouTube channel where he shows you patches and very simply explains what it's doing. And so yeah, I ended up like watching that and learning, and I think sort of put the easel away for a little while. And I also play guitar, and I was playing a show, and Ted was playing the show as well, and he had an easel. You were in it was like a 5-piece or something. Yeah, it was a large group, and anyway, I walked up to him afterwards, and I was like, "Oh, it's amazing you have an easel. I have one of those too." And we started talking, and he and I started to, then we decided to play together, and like, "Oh, let's get together and just like explore this instrument." And I do find that with the boucle, I really like playing with another person, and I play a lot on my own as well, but there is something when you're playing with another person that you're kind of interchanging these different sounds, and it's nice to explore that way. I don't know if that answered your question. Yeah.
Lovely, thank you.
Okay, sorry.
Thank you so much. So, as a listening body, I spent maybe like the first 5 minutes of this piece trying to figure out like who was playing what. And it made me realize how much energy I exert when I watch live music, creating that narrative of, oh, this person plays this instrument in this type of way, and really wanting to like attribute like a character or a style to each of you. And this piece really complicated that process for me in a way where I became exhausted and then gave up, in part because these instruments, there isn't the same kind of like visual feedback of like you press a key and then you hear the sound immediately. It was like very complicated to figure out. And I was wondering, as two individuals playing together, if there's like a merging that happens for you where you start to lose track of that boundary. And I'm curious about that. Thank you.
Yeah, I can speak to that a bit. I was reaching for the mic to say, yeah, me too. I also often try to figure out, it's funny when we rehearse, we're often like, and we listen back to the recordings we make. I'm like, how did that sound happen? Like, who was doing that? I don't even know how the configurations would allow for that sound to kind of emerge. One thing that, and this maybe speaks to the previous question a bit too. The easel is a relatively constrained instrument. It's semi-modular. It has limitations. There is this, keyboard-looking thing on the bottom, but it's not really a keyboard. And if you try to use it like one, you're going to return the instrument to the manufacturer because it doesn't work. Sorry, Buchla USA. They've been very generous to me, so I shouldn't talk about their instruments poorly. But I think it's fair to say that both Marsh and I have configured these instruments to to play themselves in certain ways. And what we're doing, at least what I'm doing, is I'm changing parameters that change the behavior of the instrument in real time in ways that I can only understand through changing the parameters. Like I don't, the knob travel is maybe a few centimeters, and that will have like profound impacts on the way that the instrument sounds and behaves. These sliders, it's like 4 centimeters of distance, and that for at least the oscillator, that goes from like 20 hertz to 3,000 hertz. It's a really big range. Yeah, I mean, part of the joy, I guess, of these instruments, at least for me, is that exploration of like figuring out how a sound emerges and being consistently frustrated and stymied and challenged and being on the verge of giving up, but kind of having the discipline to stick with it.
Are you patching between the cases or just doing it each solo?
We tried that one time and it didn't work out. No, yeah, we're just doing our own thing. Yeah. I think maybe there's time for one more question.
What's the board sticking out of your box?
Oh, that's an expander card. That's an expander card. And so when Don designed this instrument, there was a programming card that you could slot in and save a patch or create a random or sequence, add different parameters. And this one actually is made by a company called Portobello's. They're based out of Belgium, and they've created a lot of expander cards that I purchased. I have done a few of the actually, Todd gave me a card too, and there's one. Ted has one too. Did you?
This is blank.
Oh, okay, that's a blank one. Yeah, yeah.
I brought this up a plate on because I thought it would be dark, but yeah. So like this module is called the stored program sound source, and the reason it's called the stored program sound source is that this is the stored program.
Well, we should also talk about Alan Strange.
This is the computer. Yeah. So like the instrument is conceptualized as a computer. It's an analog electronic computer. This is a program, and it just kind of specifies the positions of all the controls and parameters on the panel. Alan Strange was a composer who befriended Don and basically convinced him to make this instrument in 1973-4. And his operating manual is called Programming and Metaprogramming in the Electroorganism, which is a play on John C. Lilly's book, Programming and Metaprogramming in the Human Biocomputer, which, if you're into dolphins, LSD, space aliens, government control, Navy cetacean weapons research, get a PDF, the Whole Earth Catalog. Yeah, get a PDF of that book. It's great. Okay, I think that's our time. Thanks so much. Next up is Keith Fullerton Whitman. Stick around.
This feels like speed dating. Does anybody have any questions about this guy? Oh, it's brief flash whirlwind, you know. Maybe since the mid 90s. Sorry, just come out, it's gross. Yeah, I'm a computer guy. I went to school for computer music and didn't really touch a lot of this stuff for ages. But I was in Berlin for something, and I was in Mitte, I think. And there was a store that just sold the Doepfer modulars. And it was lit up like a Christmas tree. It was during the holidays. And I just would stand in the window and eat my doner kebab and just be like, this thing, wow. Just visually, you know. And of course, they were all gray, you know, Doepfer modules back then. So I would go back every time I was in Berlin. I would buy one, I would buy two. And then I had a little system. And then that was, let's do the math, 30 years ago. And now we're back to this again, Eurorack stuff, which I love deeply. It's so interesting. Each one of these things was made by a different person, you know. So it's all these different personalities up on screen. Anyway, that's not really an answer to a question. Do you have a question? Sorry.
I do, yeah. Thank you for that performance.
Thank you.
Bearing witness to it kind of makes me think about the limits of human understanding.
Ah.
Sometimes I was trying to like follow a patch point from one input to the output, and I was wondering, like, how do you end up with a tangle of wires like that?
Yeah,
do you know what it does? And
yeah.
Yeah.
I know what it does. This was like, I tried to put together this system just to do this one thing, well, to do those, the 5 or 6 different things we just heard. But to have the maximum amount of functionality in the smallest thing. I mean, this is a pretty backpackable, you know, setup. So it's doing a lot. But really, the atomic root is that one in the top left there that says OC. It's basically, all these are computers, basically. All these modules, for the most part, are digital. They're little embedded computers. But that ornament and crime one was doing, I'd say, the heavy lifting during that. It's just doing all of the quantization of raw values as the timings are kind of going through there, and then all those like cascading cannons are all coming from that one. So everything kind of starts in that top left corner and then goes across to a million other places. But yeah, it is easy to get lost. Don't get me wrong. It's very easy to get lost doing this stuff. And I did get lost a little bit there for a second, and that's the beauty of it. Just like with any musical moment, you hope you can fully enmesh yourself in it. And I feel like I did just that, so. Any other questions? Yeah, what's up? Yeah, just in quick. Yeah, so the timing is coming from that sort of top middle, the silver section there. That's just like clock generators. They're doing subdivisions, you know. And then the top row of the output of that is doing some clocked modulations, just like random. One is full bandwidth, cycle and hold at the clock. The other one is kind of doing a drunk walk, you know, computationally. It's like it's going back and forth. And then those are kind of going, you can see the module next to them is like it's just attenuators. And then the module next to that is a shift register, which takes each successive value and pushes it through to the next one, you know. And I do it like that so that, you know, you have basically the last 8 values that any of those things are putting out to then use in discrete places, so you're not always getting the same thing. So those were mapped to things like the timing of the drums going through that section on the bottom left there. The drums are all coming from a little sampler. And then also the timing of the 3, like the bottom middle section is 3 like clocked envelope generators. They're doing most of like the timing of when the notes come in, you know, like each individual one. That sort of like 80s TRS looking one in the middle was digital FM. There's the 2 samplers, and then there's a little tiny like sawtooth, like a super saw kind of thing there. And then there's also a digital oscillator there in the middle. So those are like the 3 main voices. But the RYK one and the Ripsaw one are getting 4 voltages, like 4 notes. So right there's 8 voice polyphony. And then I can kind of like separate them off from each other or bring them back together. And then yeah, from there it just goes down into all the timing things. And then there's a mixer in the bottom right. There's a little digital effects. There's a filter. The only analog thing in the entire system is that one filter. I mean, other than like things that mix, you know, but the only analog circuit that's not just a mixer is that one filter. Everything else is pretty much digital. The delay in the top right is digital, yeah. So anyway, it kind of goes against the paradigm of this being all analog stuff, and that's maybe the perverse joy of it. But also making, you know, essentially computer music with something that resembles an analog synth is also really interesting to me. So, anyone else? Yeah, what's up?
Do you like sketch this out on paper?
I do actually, yeah. And this is a lost art, yeah.
For, you know, someone else to read
Yeah, I often, before I think of it, I just take a photo and print it out, like on a big, like as big of a piece of paper I can. And then I think of all of the different ways that you can use what it's making, and I always do this. I think very visually in this way for signal flow. And I don't think enough people do things like that. Not enough people stand away from the thing, thinking about how to use it. Most of the music made with these things is like you're at it, but I like this like sort of daydreaming process. I think I always refer to it like you're at work and your stuff is at home and you're thinking about what can be done, and that's when you get all your best thoughts, your best ideas. I think when you're kind of like physically removed from the thing. Yeah. Anyone else? I know it's a lot to look at, but yeah. But as you can see, that a lot of these are like, there's like one jack is getting like 3 cables that are going to different places. So again, it's trying to get the most functional density out of a relatively small thing. So, all right. Thanks, guys.
Q&A. Hello. Here we go. I'm gonna sit down. Any questions? Hi. What's up?
What is the machine you're using?
Well, it's the bass amp here at Roulette. It's an Eden bass amp head. And what cab is it, Steve? Yeah, Eden something or other.
Luke, can I ask you a question? Yeah. What does an amplifier mean to you conceptually?
Well, in this case, it's an instrument. It's another instrument, an electronic instrument with knobs and things, just like anything else that you've seen today, because it is an electronic instrument in a lot of ways. So yeah, in a nutshell, it's an electronic instrument interacting with the upright bass. Yes?
Can you talk about choreography?
Choreography, movement. So in the beginning, I was talking about I use movement, physicality to generate the music, generate the dynamics of different notes, different volumes, swells, and things to make a musical moment. I've done it in a bunch of different contexts with collaborations and other extended techniques. I guess it started off with that as the basis of using extended techniques with the bass alongside the interaction with the amplifier. Again, not to make the bass louder as is usually intended, but again, as an instrument, the amplifier. Yeah.
Do you transcribe anything about your various attempts? Is there a way to do that?
Let's see, do I transcribe? Well, I put down on some paper some squiggly lines, against some staff, on some musical composition paper. Are you a composer? Okay, cool, great. Because as Keith pointedly put it earlier, there are various methods of composition, first of all, but in a lot of ways the composition is in the setup itself. And essentially there are improvisational structures to be had, and this is something that has been used over and over and over again from all kinds of masters in this music, compositionally and otherwise. But yeah, I think the profundity lies in, again, the setup, using similarly to, I think, everybody here tonight, using a setup that is intended for a certain use, but using it for something else, breaking it open and finding something else to do. And perhaps exemplified here in the fact that, hey, every bass player is going to use an amplifier to play over a loud-ass drummer, and they're going to hear some feedback and going to be like, oh, it's too loud. But when I was playing with some loud-ass drummers with amps, then I would be like, oh, it's feedback, cool. And then let's explore what that is. And through a lot of encouragement with some people in this room even, going forward with that as a real exploration.
You have a lot of rhythm in your process as part of your choreography, but also, you're part of the rhythm section, so you're always interacting with drummers too.
Hey, once a bass player, always a bass player in the rhythm section. And yeah, again, music, rhythm, harmony, melody, very basic things, even if it is experimental music, which has all those things also. And so that's how I make the sounds, or how I choose to allow the sounds to come out and be generated, transformed into my own personal concept of what music is in this experimentation setup.
Your
I don't know. I didn't go to conservatory. What's up with what do they teach you in conservatory?
I mean, the basic way.
Okay, I'm kidding.
But we also have like notation for choreography.
Absolutely.
Have you played with those? Have you tried notating anything while you're discovering what your body could do and how that could make, like, generate new sounds? And were you curious about that or no?
I do collaborate quite often with movement artists, but in terms of notation for dance, no, I haven't done that. That sounds cool. Sounds like an interesting thing to explore. I'm not so interested in notation. I'm interested in documentation of the work. Notation, as in, you know, perhaps this will be recreated by somebody else, you know, as in the compositional method, the classical conservatorial compositional method of you have to notate something in order for it to be played by someone else so you don't have to play it yourself. I'm not so interested in that. I'm more so interested in the compositional concept of creating structures to discover within, so to speak.
So you ended up answering like 2 questions, and I never even asked the second one, so thank you. But it is, what I think you said notation, but I was more trying to mean while you're discovering, trying to write it down to understand. And since choreography has those notations as well,
Yeah.
if like you had any interest in trying to just, not for to be replicated, but to be understood by yourself.
Love it. Absolutely. Who should I check out? Who's some choreographical notators out there that I should check out?
Well, there are movement notators and choreographic notators. Laban is one.
Laban? Okay.
Yes.
Beautiful. Thank you. All right, cool. All right, let's have a good night. Good night. Thank you.